This episode of Transmission Interrupted was recorded June 30th, 2026. This is Transmission Interrupted, a podcast series from NETEC, the National Emerging Special Pathogens Training and Education Center. Welcome to Transmission Interrupted from NETEC.
Hello and welcome to Transmission Interrupted. My name is Jill Morgan. I'm a nurse here at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. For those of you not yet familiar with NETEC, our mission is to set the gold standard for special pathogen preparedness and response across health systems in the U.S. with the goals of driving best practices and closing knowledge gaps and developing innovative resources. NETEC works alongside and in cooperation with the CDC and is funded by ASPR, the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. Today, I am joined by Kevin Hazzard, who is a former paramedic turned acclaimed author. He's written several books, first about his life as a paramedic, 1,000 Naked Strangers, and then a book about the creation or emergence of the field of paramedic medicine, really starting with young Black men in Pittsburgh, which is called American Sirens, and most recently, a book about flight medics, No One's Coming, which is about a lot of things. Airplanes and pirates and nuclear fuel rods and Ebola all wrapped up in one great story. So welcome, Kevin, and thanks for agreeing to join us today and talk about a bunch of things.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you, Joe.
So, of course, our interest in the things that sort of NETEC and probably our audience are interested in, especially right now. It's all about Ebola and preparedness and how these things work. And I think No One's Coming is a great peek into what a lot of folks know about, but nobody really knows any of the details about. For things like air travel, people being picked up and whisked around the country as we repatriated people back then. And the Phoenix Air Group, I think the Phoenix Air Group was part of a lot of people's emergency preparedness across the country because the thought was perhaps that somebody could just come and pick up their patient no matter what and fly them somewhere. So I want to back up to sort of like, where were you in 2014 when all this was starting, and what was your perspective, you then, just over a decade ago, to the, kind of outbreak that was happening then?
I was a million miles away. I was living in LA and I was out of medicine completely. I was in the middle of writing 1,000 Naked Strangers. My life was quite different. I had two really small kids, and we were building a new life on the West Coast. And so this thing that happened, which caught people's attention, it definitely struck me because Emory, because Grady, because Atlanta. But I think like a lot of people, as the Ebola outbreak was spreading across 3 countries in West Africa, I was unaware. And ultimately, as it turns out, many of the doctors working in West Africa were unaware. But once the decision was made to bring them home, and this company, Phoenix Air, which none of us had ever heard of at that point, of course, once they said, okay, we're going to bring these people back, we're not just going to bring them back, but we're going to bring them back to Atlanta, and Grady's going to drive them across the city, and they're going to drop them off at Emory, I suddenly was very much attached to the story because these are all places and people and things I know. That footage that everybody has always seen of the ambulance moving through the city with a paramedic behind the wheel. I knew Gail Stalling. She was a friend of mine. So I felt very close to it. I knew what those people were probably going through. Having never done it myself, I couldn't truly know, but we've all been around scary things and I knew those people. And so I was just sort of watching it from afar, kind of astounded that this sort of a thing was even possible. It just didn't, you hear Ebola, your mind thinks a lot of things. It doesn't think international travel.
Yeah. Well, I think it's funny. I when I'm talking to folks about, sort of why those first patients were brought to Emory, I said, we didn't do a very good job, frankly, of getting out in front of that news because, I guess in some ways, people are familiar with the fact that the CDC is here in Atlanta, or that one of their big branches is here in Atlanta. And even if you didn't know it before you watched The Walking Dead, I guess it blows up
Mhm.
on one of the episodes of The Walking Dead. But, you know, if you know what the CDC is about, you'd think, well, gosh, what happens if somebody who works at the CDC gets exposed to something that they're working with, right? Or we hear about CDC employees getting deployed across the world to respond to an outbreak. It seems natural to me now to say, well, what happens to those people if they get exposed? Where would they go? But I don't think many people had really had that sort of forethought. And so it was a complete shock, I think, to a lot of people here in Atlanta that we were bringing people back here. And certainly even within the hospital, that it was definitely newsworthy and stayed newsworthy for a long time. And now here we are, well over a decade later. And I think one of the reasons that your book is so captivating to many of us is that the situation's very different now.
Mhm.
From your perspective, having been outside the business now, what do you think about where we are now?
It's disappointing. One of the characters in the book, Dr. Linda Mabula, who was, sort of on the front lines in West Africa, very much a finger in the dam. She and I are still in communication, and I asked her because she's working on this outbreak as well, and I said, "Where are we? Where are you? Where is the state of preparedness?" And she said, "It's exactly where it was in July of 2014. We learned nothing, or at least the things we learned, we allowed ourselves to forget. And so we're starting all over again," which to her was heartbreaking because she quite literally risked her life to learn those lessons. Doctors and nurses at Emory University put their lives on the line to learn those lessons. One of the great things that came out of 2014 was Dr. Bruce Ribner's team figuring out through simple lab work and, simple ICU care that, oh, hey, these potassium levels are so outrageously low that you can't possibly give your patient too much potassium. And so they jumped on the phone with doctors in Africa and they just said, basically, flood them with potassium, you can't hurt them. And that phone call literally turned around the mortality rate, and it began to drop from that day just precipitously, and just everything that was learned in those moments went down. Everything that was learned in those moments helped to lower the mortality rate. We learned about preparedness. We learned about prevention. We learned about transportation, the importance of all these things should something come up. And we allowed those lessons over time to just sort of turn into smoke. And now that we face this again, we find ourselves in a similar thing. So it's watching it from the outside. It's a little bit surprising, and it's certainly frustrating because these are things 12 years ago that I think we had our hands around.
Yeah, I think, in addition to people being surprised, there was also maybe a feeling, not just maybe a feeling, we heard it loud and clear. Why would you bring this disease for which there's no known cure to our city, right? Or to any city, right? Just willingly. And I will say that our patients, and for those who are unfamiliar, I was the first nurse to receive those patients here in the United States. So the very first patient, Kent Brantley, that came back, I was at the bedside when he got dropped off by Grady EMS and took care of him for that time, and the rest of our patients here. But those patients also had a lot of guilt, I think, and worry because they were leaving behind co-workers in the field at those Ebola treatment units, ETUs, across Africa, who were they knew they were going to get different treatment than somebody they had been working side by side with would get there or somewhere else. But I think one of the things that you just mentioned, it helped get over that guilt, which was whatever we can do here in a well-resourced environment, we want to help inform what happens somewhere else. And so, I remember we were reviewing with one of our patients who was a provider, their lab work. And as you said, the importance of electrolytes. They looked at their lab work and said, this so helps explain that sometimes as they were going about treating a patient, they might, maybe the patient's looking like, oh gosh, I think they're turning a corner. They might be getting a little better. And then the patient would basically sit up at their bed or on their cot and just keel over. And we know now that that's probably from an arrhythmia, right? An electrolyte abnormality that leads to irregular heartbeats that leads to cardiac arrest. That's just so tragic when the difference is supplementing potassium or magnesium or making sure their blood sugar doesn't drop. And so when people wonder, like, why do we bring people back? Why do we go through all this, what Phoenix Air went through and what the medics went through and what everybody involved went through? It's to drive that forward and make care better. Because you want those dollars, even if you're concerned mostly about like good use of dollars spent, then let's target the things that really make a difference. And in order to know that, you have to do that front end work. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the technology that allowed the transports was developed with a very simple concept in mind, which is, when an emergency hits and resources are needed, you need those resources to be willing to go. And policies that existed at that point, because there wasn't a technology available to bring people home, it came down to treat in place, which essentially means you stay there until you get better or you die. People were beginning to balk at such a thing. And so, there was a real concern that, hey, if we don't have the capability to bring our experts home, then our experts may not want to go. And that was why the CDC had Phoenix Air develop the aeromedical biocontainment unit in the first place, which was a revolutionary piece of technology. But then jump forward to 2014, I think they began those conversations in 08, 09, jump forward to 2014, and you have Dr. William Walters, his career emergency medical physician, who's working for the State Department, who immediately recognized in what was happening in West Africa as a moment in which the world's experts needed to go. And when Dr. Human Khan got sick and died, when Kent Brantley got sick and was near death, he recognized that this is yet another inflection point in which the world's experts are watching what we do. And if we continue to allow people to die, the world's experts are going to say, well, I'm not sure I want to step into that breach. And, to get back to Dr. Mabula for just a second, she's a Congolese American. She has, very strong feelings about what she would like to see on the ground in Africa. And it really comes down in her mind to capacity building. But when there's an outbreak, you can't do what's ideal. You have to do what needs to be done in this moment to save lives. And what needs to be done in any particular moment to save lives is to bring in the people who can help do that, to supplement, local efforts. And so, she looked around at what she was doing and what her colleagues were doing, understood how critical it was, and understood that, again, that the world was watching what happened to them. And Kent Brantley was her patient. And she knew if Kent dies, people are going to say, well, why on earth would I go to die? And it became a very important thing. And those, why do we bring people home as opposed to trying to shuttle them over to Kenya? Because we have the facilities here, because there are people. And, that is, what we do as a nation is we rescue our own and then turn around, take all that information we've learned and disperse it, as it should be. And as we've done so many times in the past, though, as we're not in the moment doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the Phoenix Air Group and their plane as a great technological advance, but it also strikes me as and I don't mean this in a negative way, but as just a great example of creative, never heard the word no or can't be done.
Yeah, cowboy ingenuity.
Seat of the pants, exactly. Cowboy ingenuity is a perfect phrase for it, because it really was like, how are we going to do this? Okay, let's try this. Let's try that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
It's three people in a room. Yeah, it's 3 people in a room trying to work their way around an intractable problem. And when that happens, like what can you do? You have to improvise. You have to come up with something. And that was how they developed this piece of technology. Like when you think of a private jet, we think of luxury, but we don't often think of space. And it's a really, really small space. And so they had to design something that was going to fit into this teeny little space that could transport, theoretically, that could transport measles, that could transport medication-resistant pneumonia, that could transport any sort of airborne virus or a particulate-borne virus, but also something like Ebola. And how do you do such a thing in a plane where people are used to massive filters and being able to hose down and all these different things that you have in in a big facility? How can you possibly do that in a plane? And they had to figure it out. And ultimately what they came up with was this tiny little tent, basically, that, was just big enough for a patient and a provider and a few pieces of equipment. And somebody had to crawl into it, and it's barely 5 feet tall, and they had to crouch over there and do the work. But they came up with it, definitely seated their pants, figuring it out. I've always thought of that scene in Apollo 13 where the engineers are sitting around and the shuttle is, somewhere on the far side of the moon. And the one guy turns around and he goes, we got to fit this thing into this thing in one circle and one square. And he says, using nothing but this. And it's just a pile of garbage, basically.
Yeah.
And they did it. And that was essentially the approach that Phoenix Air used when they developed the ABCS.
Yep, absolutely. I think one of the quotes you have in the book is basically saying yes to things and then figuring out how you're going to make that work. Like,
Yeah.
yes, we can do it. Now how?
Yeah.
I mean, I think probably the stories get told, hopefully, about the success cases. There are probably just as many people out there saying, my spouse had a great idea and was sure it could be done, and then it failed miserably. But this was a real testimony to trying it out, making sure that it worked, obviously, before you put people in it and put anybody at risk. But that idea of just going out on a limb and saying, yeah, it hasn't been done before, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. We're going to find a way to make this work. Yeah.
Well, this is a company that in the early 80s gets started because it's failing. And it's, they're two brothers, Mark and Dent Thompson. They have this tiny aviation business that's about to cease to be. And so they had to scramble to come up with an idea. And their idea was, hey, let's be the company that transports the most dangerous explosives to the most dangerous places because nobody else wants that job. And so there won't be any competition, which sounds like a good idea from a certain point of view, I'm sure. But if you can get over the idea that you may blow yourself up, how do you do that? Neither of them had any experience in that. And so that's how this company is born, with two brothers sitting down going, okay, here's what we're going to do. How on earth do we make that happen? And, through the 80s, through the 90s, they perfect that ethos. And so when they move into medical transports, of course, it's with the same thought in mind. And up comes 2014. They don't know anything about Ebola. Their technology has been approved for pretty much every known pathogen, notably not Ebola. And they had to figure out if they could pull it off, which was very much an open question. Very much an open question.
Yep. Yeah. No, I mean, I think no matter what your plans are, and I say this now knowing that we have got hospitals all across the United States who are hopefully getting prepared for any kind of pathogen patient, right? What we call now high consequence infectious diseases. Not just because World Cup is here and not just because there's an Ebola outbreak and maybe a Marburg outbreak, and there's always a Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever outbreak, and there's always a Lassa fever outbreak, but because it's the right thing to do because things can happen anytime and you need to be ready. But for most hospitals across the country, that readiness will never be tested. And I think about that, and I guess there are two ways to think about that. One is to think, well, then why does it matter? Why do I have to get prepared if it's something that's not going to happen? But I don't know anybody who says, I haven't had a house fire in 10 years. Why don't I just get rid of these smoke detectors? And, why do I even need the fire department? Like, people wouldn't do that, right? Because there's too much at risk.
I know that there's two things happen in 2014 immediately before these resources in Atlanta are called upon. One is the CDC decides to cut funding for your lab, as you're well aware. So the unit itself stays open, but your lab closes. And then the other thing is Grady EMS shuts down its special operations team, which was its group of people trained with you guys for years to do these kind of transports. And again, that was because they hadn't been used. And so people thought, well, we haven't used it, so we don't need it. That's like canceling your life insurance because you haven't died yet. It is so short-sighted, and it's kind of ridiculous if you think about, that's really, it's bananas. There's no other word for it. And luckily they were both able to get online quite quickly and come back.
Yeah.
But, that resistance to preparation, I think, is so important. There are two really interesting examples, I think, if you look at what happened in 2014. So take Emory as the standard. You guys were prepared, had been prepared for 14 years. It goes off without a hitch. Another man, Patrick Sawyer, an American who's of Liberian descent, steps onto a plane, flies into Lagos, Nigeria, 14 million people, the most populous city on the African continent, unaware that he has Ebola. By the time he lands, he's nearly unconscious. He dies very quickly. They are able to wrap their arms around him and contain that outbreak to a very small number of contacts and a very small number of deaths because they had this incredibly robust contact tracing system that they immediately put into place and were able to keep that under control. You look at that versus what happened in Dallas, that, a patient arrives pretty much the exact same way, unaware that he had Ebola until he hit the ground, at which point he was near death. Staff at the facility said, well, we are not prepared for this. We don't have the equipment for this. We're not ready for this. They had no choice. The hospital basically said, we'll deal with it. And two nurses wound up getting sick. They lost their patient and two nurses get sick. One, and one gets transported to Emory. I believe the other was sent to Lincoln, Nebraska.
I think she went to NIH, but yeah.
Okay. But they, that is an example of one is a massive city that had the potential to become, the gasoline on the fire that really turned the 24 outbreak into a worldwide disaster. They clamp down on it. And the other is, a guy goes into a totally unprepared hospital in Dallas and, two nurses nearly lose their lives because of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, more recently, even, and some of folks will be aware, we had a loss of fever case in Iowa about a year and a half ago. And I think we ended up with 180 healthcare workers exposed, right? So enough of those, I think it was 53 were high risk exposures, which means you didn't have PPE on, or you didn't have enough PPE on, or you had a spray or a splash or a needle stick. That's 53 people who had to be out of work quarantined for 3 weeks. Now, I don't know any healthcare system in the country that's got 53 spare healthcare workers that they can just have on the payroll and not working. Preparedness and paying, whether it's the bill to your monitoring service for your smoke detectors, or it's your life insurance policy, or having a fire extinguisher, whatever it is, those things are so much cheaper than trying to backpedal through this. And certainly the health and safety of our patients and our staff is worth, hopefully, more than any of this, even what it costs to get PPE on people.
Yeah.
All right. I want to ask you something because I think you got this quote in the book that I really liked. And I mentioned this to you before, that you just mentioned Mark and Dent Thompson, and you say Dent Thompson can't stand to be bored. And I just wonder to what extent that also is a reflection of you and maybe also even the people who tend to become medics.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. If you take anyone who works on an ambulance, they could quit their job tomorrow and get a raise at Starbucks. So, okay, why are they there? Because, you could go to nursing school and you can make a lot more money. You can do all kinds of things to make a lot more money. So why practice this brand of medicine? And I think it's because, and there's a lot of reasons, but it is so personal, and there's a lack of control. There's just this, you're out in the world, you are meeting people where they are, and you're kind of taking things as they come. And you're, if it's just an old woman who's sitting there, then it's just you and an old woman having a conversation. But if your call is to 13 people who have been shot, you're there where those 13 people were shot. Your boots are crunching over shell casings. You have to want to be in that situation because it's a difficult way to practice medicine, and the rewards compared to other branches of the field, like the reward is the adventure, the reward is the excitement, the unpredictability of it. There's absolutely a sense of pride that you take in knowing that, like, there's no way you can win and that you show up anyway. I think of Gail and her partner John Arevalo, the day the the Ebola flight comes in and the whole world's watching them, and they're like rock paper scissoring on the tarmac to see who's going to transport this guy, and they've just been called in on the fly. Like, it's such an unexpected but lovely moment of just people, kind of being like, look, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm down for it. And so I think a lot of us have that. I suspect you do too, Jill. Like, there's an easier way to work as a nurse other than at a highly communicable disease unit.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was an ER nurse for about 15 years in Atlanta. And I think that there is something to that culture of, I don't like to be bored, absolutely true. But also that feeling of, I even got the feeling while you were talking about it, because I think it's so ingrained. When I was in the middle of a shift in an ER, a busy ER, you'd get to a point where it felt like I've never surfed, but you know how when you see somebody catch that wave and they're riding it, and they're not just at rest at the top of a wave, right? I mean, you are having to work to stay right where you are, but you are up on top of something that could just tumble you any moment. But
That's
I
right.
would get that feeling of riding this wave, and I would even hear, so silly now, but I would hear, like, in my own mind, and I can't hum it, but the drum solo from Wipeout, because I would be thinking about like that you're kind of just trying to stay in that space where everything that's going on, and you're not behind, and you've got sort of a handle on what the chaos is around you. And I think for a lot of folks, there's something in them that feeds them. I want to say that no, there's not enough money, and no, there's not enough recognition of how much work and how hard these jobs are. But I remember years ago, some big reception, I think Ted Turner must have been there, because I think it was like, I can't remember now. I remember one of the medics coming back and talking about how much money was in the room, right? Like, the people who were there were all like cajillionaires, right? Just VIP kind of people. But somebody had a heart attack. And here come these medics, right? There's not a person in that room making all that money that meant a tinker's damned with that guy who's having a heart attack.
Yeah.
The two people at that time probably making $13.50 an hour go in and save that guy's life. We should pay them more. But it also is, to me, is sort of the fundamental, like, how we value things in our society.
Yeah.
And that all the money in the world will not buy you an extra 5 minutes or the knowledge of how to save somebody's life unless you're willing to go out there and pursue that. And I think my hat's off to everybody who works in an ER, works in a paramedic, fire department, police. I mean, there are jobs that just suck, and you have to want to do them for the right reasons. And probably sometimes the stories make the news only when people choose them for the wrong reasons. But I think that overall, there are an awful lot of good people out there doing really, really hard work.
I couldn't agree with you more. It is a tough job, and at times you do think to yourself, what the hell am I doing here? But I think ultimately, like, there's a weird sort of perverse pride that I think people who are up against the wall but pull it off take. Having worked at Grady, I know what that ER is like. Those people are slammed. Even the doctors. I mean, just like, sure, there are multiple levels of people working there, but look at those doctors. They have a ton of patients, and not just patients, but they have a ton of brand new doctors who are making all kinds of decisions on the fly that attending physician is very specifically and very concretely responsible for. So if a first-year resident, if it's July 2nd and someone has gotten in a car wreck, and that first-year resident makes a decision or screws up a chest tube or puts an ET into someone's belly, that comes back on the attending, and the attending knows it. And the attending's in the other room, dealing with this dialysis patient who's skipped 4 appointments and is now, his entire life is out of whack, and he's one breath away from swirling down the drain. And you got to keep track of all these different things, and they do it with such incredible grace. And there's a lot of pride to that. I mean, I went back and I spent a night with Grady EMS, and I rode with them, and which is really a lot of fun. And I spent a lot of time, of course, in the trauma bay. And there was this attending physician, and I wrote about her because I updated 1,000 Naked Strangers with a new chapter, and I wrote about her as this kind of like the conductor of this mad symphony. Like she wasn't playing the music, but she was just sitting there, sort of tuning it. And you can't tell me that someone as smart as she is, as capable as she is, couldn't get a job in a lot of other places. But you also can't tell me that she doesn't take a hell of a lot of pride in knowing that on a Friday night, when Grady is at its greatest, that she's in full command and everybody around her knows it. I mean, there's just something to that,
Yeah.
full stop.
Yeah. It is very powerful. Well, I think that we could probably talk a long time about all these stories. I am grateful to you for putting together such an engaging book and for talking to all the people you talked to make this book happen. I wondered, just maybe as a last question, you interviewed a lot of people. I mean, you talked to a lot of folks. Certainly, I got the opportunity to meet Dr. Linda not that long ago. I got to go to DRC not that long ago. I think that there are so many dedicated people trying to make the situations in other countries that face these pathogens all the time much, much better. Were there people that you wished that you could have talked to that you couldn't? Was there anybody that was sort of the interview itself was a surprise?
To bring it home to you, I was pretty astounded when I spoke with Dr. Ribner. Such a fantastic guy, but the story of what happened to Emory was really a shock to me. When you say Emory University, I have a friend who is she's a nurse practitioner. She got a job in Jackson Hole, which is like an impossible place to get a job, but people heard she worked at Emory and like, bang, she went to the front of the line and got hired. So when I hear Emory, I think, oh, it's Emory. They can do anything. It's just one of those hospitals. But when you find out that there was a lot of concern both around, without, but also within Emory about whether or not this could be pulled off, there was anger, the frustration, the bomb threats, all the crazy things that were happening around this hospital that many of us find to be, I think Emory, Grady, and Children's Healthcare are like their peace of mind to every Atlantan. So why is it that this happened? And to hear Dr. Ribner talk about it, to explain, how the lack of understanding led to fear, led to all these other things, and how that affected the hospital, that was really surprising to hear. The person I most wanted to talk to that I wasn't able to talk to, quite frankly, and I didn't expect to be able to talk to him, but certainly I didn't not try, was President Obama. The United States government was not directly involved in the first two transports. They essentially said, we won't stop it, but we're not going to do it. But, I wondered about, as 2014 heats up and the Ebola outbreak spreads from 1 to 2 to 3 countries, risks boiling over. Anthony Fauci at one point says, that's the point at which I really felt like we were staring into the abyss. And permission is asked to bring these patients home. I wonder what was going through his mind, because this is an incredibly risky decision to take in the midst of an outbreak that the United States government and the world's governments had not yet stepped into. This was something that we were not involved in, that was sort of over there, not here, but he chose to allow it to be brought here. And I really wonder about what was going through his mind, how anxious he was. We've all seen those photos of the war room, while they were tracking down Osama bin Laden, and you can see the weight of these big decisions on their faces. I have to think that some of that had to be with him with this as well. And then, what he felt when you guys pulled it off, when the whole, when Phoenix Air, when Grady EMS, when Emory University Hospital, when you handled it the way you did. How did that feel, having made that decision, knowing that so many people were wildly against it and chomping at the bit to see him fall on his face? And then he decides from there, okay, we're going to go in and, we're going to step in and sort of try to help put an end to this thing. I would just love to know what was going through his mind during all these different phases.
Yeah. He had the Emory, several of the teams come to the CDC, and he came to the CDC and met with some hospital leaderships. I did not get to sit at that table. Being a bedside nurse, those options are usually available to people far above me. But he did walk through a room where we had all been sort of admonished to, keep our hands where they could be seen. Don't make any sudden movements. This is the president coming through, Secret Service is there. We're in just an audience room, and he had come down the aisle. I was several seats in, but he came down the aisle, and we had one of our security guards who was a massive human, Tyrone, just a wonderful, wonderful human being, but also this big guy who was on the edge and got to shake Obama's hand. And so I'm sitting there listening to him. And when he finishes speaking, I was surprised that he went back up that same aisle. But I thought to myself, I'm not letting this pass. I know they told me to not make any sudden moves. And I know Tyrone is there and is this, like a blockade. But I literally dove over Tyrone to shake Obama's hand as he left. And, I think my 80-something-year-old mom at the time, I don't think I could have done anything in my life to make her happier than to say, I got to shake Obama's hand. My mother just thought that was, she really thought that America's problems had been solved. Being an older white woman in the South, really felt like we've made good progress here when Obama was elected. And then when I got to shake his hand, she was thrilled. So I think that he did understand. I mean, I know just from talking to some other people that were in and at that conversation, that I think in many ways he understood even the implications of things like waste handling and wastewater and supply chain. He got it in a way that I think was deeper than a lot of people might have guessed about just a decision that sounds easy and make everybody else deal with the details. And I think that that's an important piece that maybe some people don't understand still, is that we now have 13 hospitals across this country that have spent the last several years preparing teams and training on the regular and having the right PPE and trying to do a lot of good evidence base for their practices and how we're doing this. So that even if they haven't had a patient yet, we feel pretty darn confident that they can do these things successfully. I think that we are ready to handle a patient that needed to be brought back to the United States. We still don't have enough preparedness across the country as we'd like, but we're ahead of where we were. And I think we just have to keep pushing it forward. I greatly appreciate your book. I hope it will be an impetus for other people to think about how they want to get involved, whether that's wanting to be a paramedic and live a fairly exciting pirate life for not much money, or whether that's, you're at a hospital and you want to think about joining a team of people that get prepared for Ebola and other things that you've never heard of. I think that we need stories that make those people not just heroes or something in some vague sense, but actually give you a feel for what they're actually doing. And I think that's one of the things that I think your book does is really show you kind of almost the underbelly of some of this stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that, because that's really, underbelly is a great word. I think everyday heroes is something that we don't often look for, but that's ultimately what we need. We assume that the great work, the heroic work is done by people who are nothing like us, which is, the fatal flaw. It's not the case. You are not powerless. That the incredible things that are done around you are done by people who look, sound, live just like you do. They simply made the decision to do this incredibly difficult thing. You too could make that decision. All of us can. People always say, oh, it takes a special person to do that kind of work. Sure, it takes you. That's it. Are you willing? The answer is either yes or no. And if you're willing, that makes you the special person to do that job. And, everyday heroes are what changes the world. And, that could be any one of us.
Yep. Say yes and then figure it out.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. I just appreciate it greatly. And appreciate you being with us today. All right. So I hate to even wrap it up, but we're going to have to. So for those of you listening at home, thank you for tuning into this episode with Kevin Hazzard about his great new book, No One's Coming. We hope you'll join us for future episodes on a wide range of topics, from healthcare worker safety, personal protective equipment, of course, and infectious diseases of all kinds. If you have any questions for NETEC or ideas for future shows, please feel free to contact us at info@netec.org. That's info@netec.org. Or you can find us on the web at netec.org/podcast, where you can also subscribe to future episodes and find out more about today's topic. So thank you again, Kevin, and thank you for joining us on Transmission Interrupted.
You've been listening to Transmission Interrupted, a NETEC podcast, produced and edited by Benjamin Madsen, with additional support provided by Britton Clark, Veronica Lavaro, Jason Noble, and Lisa Stone. Special thanks to our guests and the subject matter experts at NETEC for their insight and guidance. This podcast is supported by the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. For more information, tools, and training on special pathogen preparedness, visit netec.org. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for tuning in to Transmission Interrupted.